webinar series, Road to Recovery. The title today is Role of Standards for Smart City Development. With us today, we have four distinguished panelists. Mr. Muhammad Farabi Yusof, Muhammad Yusof, Head of Smart City Unit Plan Malaysia. The second one is Mr. Huzal Mizar Hussain, Senior Director of Standardization, Department of Standards Malaysia. Dr. Fazula Sohaimi Abdul Malik, Chairman of MCMC. And finally, Muhammad Shah Jahan Muhammad Iqbal, Malaysia Smart Cities Alliance Pro-Tem member. And without further ado, I will now hand the floor over to our moderator for today, Kamarul Arif from the Sustainable Development Technology Division of MIT. Over to you, Kamarul.
Okay, thank you, Farah, for the introduction. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I am Kamarul Arif Omar. I will be your moderator for today's webinar series. Welcome to my webinar series, Road to Recovery, Episode 9, Role of Standards for Smart City Development. With us today, we have our recognized panelists. First, Mr. Mat Farabi Yusof. He is the head of Smart City Units Plan Malaysia. He has the experience at various levels of urban planning industry in Malaysia since 2002. He served as a town planner in private sector and government agency. Also, he has a very strong interest and good in strategic planning, especially involving the urban policy. He also in charge of Urban Planning Education Accreditation Committee back in 2014 to 2016. Our next panelist is Mr. Huzal Miza Hussain. He's a Senior Director of Standardization Division, Department of Standards Malaysia. He is an engineer by profession. He's in charge of managing the department as the national standards body. He was responsible in providing high-level coordination and technical expertise for the development and implementation of strategic policy. Mr. Huzal Miza also assumed many responsibility in standardization and accreditation, such as overseeing the development of national and international standard and managing the laboratory accreditation scheme. Our third panelist is Dr. Fazula Sohaimi Abdul Malik. He is the chairman of Malaysian Communication and Multimedia Commission MCMC. Dr. Fazul has more than 22 years of industry experience holding several senior positions both in public and private sector. He previously served as both a commissioner and executive of MCMC from 2016 until 2018. Prior to returning to the MCMC, Dr. Fazula was the Vice Chancellor and the Chief Executive of Perdana University. And finally, our fourth panelist is Mr. Muhammad Shah Jahan Muhammad Iqbal. He is the Malaysian Smart City Alliance Pro-Tem member holding the Regulatory Policy and Standards Unit. He is the Vice President and Treasurer of the FTTH Council Asia Pacific. He is also the founder and chief technology officer of a dynamic telecommunication company, Triops, Malaysia Sdn Bhd. He has extensive professional experience with a significant leadership accomplishment in the telecommunication industry because of his passion and commitments toward advancing the local telecommunication industry. Now, let us move on to our discussion. A smart city is an innovative cities that use information and communication technologies, ICT, and other components to enhance quality of life, effectiveness of city operation, and increase competitiveness. Smart city depend on integrated and organized structure to efficiently deliver better services. Taking into this consideration, it is crucial to align the ecosystem into one common standardization. Standards deliver universal policies for the growth and innovation. Standards can be influential instrument to reach smart cities objective. For this session, We would like to explore the needs and role of standards for smart city development and to understand the common interest between public and private sector upon the role of standards for the smart city development. Now, I would like to invite our panelists to share their organization experience based on today's topic. We will start first with Mr. Farabi. So, Mr. Farabi, the Malaysian Smart City Framework has successfully launched by our 7th Prime Minister of Malaysia on 23rd September 2019 at Hotel Histana, Kuala Lumpur. This framework comprises of policy, direction, strategies, initiative, and action plan to be served as a guideline and references to all cities, agencies, developers, and stakeholders in developing and implementing sustainable solution in addressing cities' challenge. From your experience, can you simply explain what Plan Malaysia contribution to the development of smart cities in Malaysia? Mr. Farabi?
Assalamualaikum. Very good afternoon to all panelists. And Doc, thank you very much. So my name is Farabi and I'm from Plan Malaysia, head of the Smart City unit. So before that, I would like to introduce our department is actually under the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. And as per your question, Doc, actually Plan Malaysia involved, apart from drafting the Malaysian Smart City Framework, which has been launched last year by the Prime Minister, basically we involved in 4 areas, taking into account what have been mentioned from the framework itself. The first one is on the it was mentioned about the accreditation of the smart city standard shall be introduced to set a standard for a smart city qualification and recognition. As we know, for now there is no standard on smart cities because smart cities is still at the initial stage. So I believe there is a lot of standard if you look at telecommunication per se, but to be honest, in the smart city itself, there is no standard has been established. So in the framework I've mentioned about, one is about the introduction of the standards, and the second one is about the city qualification and recognition, which is we can call as a rating as well. So Plan Malaysia have been entrusted together with the Department of Standard Malaysia to look into this, and I think we have started the journey, and now we are in the midst of evaluating one standard. And I think the focus for now is on the smart city indicators, because before we come to the giving any qualification and recognition, I think we need to look at the indicators. And we are very lucky because at the global level, it is already there. It's called ISO 37122. So we are taking that ISO 37122 into account, and we are looking into the details whether it can be used as the total adoption or indigenous. The second part of the role of Plan Malaysia in the smart city is about the awareness of the smart city itself. So in the communication plan for the Malaysian Smart City Blueprint, it is mentioned that our role, because we are under the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, it is our role to help the local government in terms of their capacity buildings and also the awareness. The third one is about the preparations of the, we call as smart city planning. So cities need to have their planning on the smart cities, and we are assisting local government as well to prepare their blueprint. So now we have started with 3, I would say 2 local government. One is Labuan Corporation. Second one is Majlis Bandaraya Ipoh, and the third one is we are preparing a smart city for the Federal Territory as well. And the fourth one, this one is under the RMK 12. Inshallah, if we get the budget, and we will proceed with a very big project. It's called Malaysian Urban Observatory. So Malaysian Urban Observatory will be like a big data analytics for the urban areas. So this is under the or we call the abbreviation is MUO. We are going to have one smart city platform. So we are focusing on that, and inshallah, if the budget will be with us, then we will embark the journey very soon. So I think that is the 4 pillars about the functions of Plan Malaysia in the smart city area.
Okay, thank you Farabi for the explanation about the contribution of the Plan Malaysia for the smart city development in Malaysia. Now, for Mr. Miza, as we heard from Farabi just now, a successful smart city tend to have one common thing, a strategic approach. The strategies ensure the incorporation of different components of smart cities under one uniform standards. So the process of implementing smart city is involving large-scale involvement of capital, technology, talent, authorities, communities, and industry players. In your position, can you explain us about the process of developing a Malaysia standard according to Department of Standards Malaysia? Mr. Miza?
Thank you very much. Kind introduction. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon. Distinguished panelists, audience here this afternoon. Before I go into detail of the question that has been asked by our moderator, Dr. Kamarul Arif, so perhaps I would like to briefly introduce the Department of Standards Malaysia. Basically, we are the national standards body. We are now under the ambit of Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI. So we were established in 1996 under Standards of Malaysia Act 1996, Act 549, when SIRIM at the time was corporatized into SIRIM Berhad. So we took over the function of National Standards Body, whereby we developed national standards, and also as the National Accreditation Body, whereby we accredit conformity assessment bodies, like inspection bodies, certification bodies, and whatnot. But for the purpose of today's webinar, I will be focusing on standards only. Well, basically, we in relation to the smart city framework, as mentioned by the moderator just now, we as the national standards body, we develop national standards, Malaysian standard. So currently, we have already established around 5,000 Malaysian standards in various fields. With regard to the smart city standards, as mentioned by our previous panelists, Mr. Farabi, so we have yet to establish one at national level, even though at international level, they have many initiatives on standards development, for example, at international level, at ISO, IEC level, even at IEEE, even though they are not really international, but they call it international bodies. Also at regional level, we can see initiative by SAN and SANELEC, the European ETSI, for the telecommunication. At international level, we have ITU. So a lot of bodies has already initiated this kind of initiative to develop smart city framework standards. So as of now, we have yet to establish the standards. But in terms of the initial discussion, as mentioned by Mr. Farabi, we have already discussed even at the level of KPKT under the council. So we have already cooperated with Plan Malaysia to establish a committee, national committee, to look into the development of Malaysian standards for smart cities. Going to the question how we develop national standards. So basically, this is something that we follow international best practices, whereby we need to establish committees. We cannot, by ourselves as a national standards body, develop our own document but we have to establish committees. Under the Act, Section 13, so we have to establish a council. Council, basically, the function is to advise the minister with regard to the policy and also program installation. From this council, so we have another layer of committee we call National Standards Body. So National Standards Committee, NSC. So under this NSC, we have also technical committees and working group. Now, overall, we have about 400 something technical committees that we have established. The only thing that when we started this initiative together with Malaysia and Mike, so we have established a committee called NSCD 29. This is just, abbreviation of a code of the committee, but basically we have been, mandated to work on digitalization activities in smart cities, whereby relevant stakeholders has been invited and joined the committee. The basic principle of standards, basically, it has to be a consensus document. As I mentioned earlier, we have international, regional, national, even at industry level. So the level of consensus is different. If international level of consensus at international level, but now we are trying to develop our national policy, so we have to use national standards. So national standard, we have been mandated under the Act to develop national standards. So the first principle of standards basically is consensus. So we have to develop national consensus. That means everyone agrees in Malaysia that this is our national standards. That's the principle consensus. Number one is openness. So we have to open the development in a sense that it can be exclusive. Exclusive working environment. So we have to open this to every stakeholder to participate. But in order to be effective, so we have to establish a committee, which we have already done that. So the last principle is basically transparency. We cannot work in silo. We have to be transparent, whereby under the standard development process, there's one stage whereby we have to do public comment. Whatever draft that has been deliberated by the committee need to be issued for public comment, and the committee need to sit down again and relook at the comment, and of course the final approval of Malaysian Standards is by the minister, currently Minister of International Trade and Industry, MITI. So this is the principle. The other point that I would like to highlight about the principle of national standards development is about balanced representative or balanced interest. When we develop or establish a committee, we have to make sure that all stakeholders, all interests has a balanced representation, because we don't want to create one single stakeholder predominate the discussion and the decision of the national standard. In terms of who to propose any development, so everyone can propose, of course, but we have already established the committee. Any proposal will be tabled to the committee, whether we can accept any proposal to develop certain standards with regard to smart city. So basically, this is something that the role of nationals. As we are the secretariat, the standard is being developed by the committees. So we have established the committee. Then now we are ready to move forward in terms of supporting the national framework for smart city. The other point, basically, as I made, one of the questions that the moderator has posed just now is basically about how to, get everybody on board. So I think that's the point that I just highlighted about the balanced interest. We would like to all industry stakeholders, academia, regulatory agencies to be part of the committee, so that we can establish or develop a very quality standard for the sector. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miza, for the explanation on how Malaysia developed our standards process. And next, Dr. Fazul, as we know from Mr. Miza's explanation, the development of smart cities cannot be effective without valid legal fulfillment. Consequently, Both political and legal components are critical for smart city development. City government must increase proactive steps for applying and managing smart city development by framing law and policies, especially the standards, to become the needs for the development. Based on this statement, are there any guidelines or regulation that MCMC have in related to the smart city development currently? Dr. Fazul?
Thank you, Dr. Kamarul. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon to all. Now, MCMC is a commission that regulates the communications and multimedia industry, and therefore, when with the oversight of the industry, we cover things like telecommunications, broadcasting, online activities, as well as the postal and courier sector. So coming down to the smart city perspective, at this stage, I think everybody will agree that there is no specific standard that one could apply towards a smart city. The closest I would say of having a standard would be at the network level. As in all smart cities, what is quite key to it will be the connectivity. So when you need to have connectivity, therefore there must be a standard of how all networks are to be connected. Otherwise, you just won't be connected, and it won't be so smart after all. And to do that, the MCMC has got a, if you want, a link to what we call as the Malaysian Technical Standards Forum Berhad, and MTFSB. This is where we bring together the industry, where they can deliberate, benchmark, and thereafter propose a technical code, which is pretty much somewhat like a technical standard that all our providers will actually voluntarily adhere to. Again, I use the word here, voluntary. We don't have a means of law to force everybody to use only a particular code, because due to the competitive nature of the market, people will opt for many technologies. And thereof, what is important is that all these technologies need to be able to communicate to each other. And hence the code provides, if you want, the basis of the language for them to connect to each other. And with regards to MCMC, when you look at the infrastructure perspective, currently the government had undertaken a journey way back in 2008 when the government adopted a public-private partnership to improve the connectivity of broadband. I think we all recall the early days of high-speed broadband, which eventually became Unify for Telecom Malaysia. And for time, it has its own package names, and likewise for our licensees like Maxis. So with that network, we realized that it had been able to empower many cities. And today, there is a higher demand for connectivity. And recently, because of the COVID-19, the demand for connectivity had been a lot more, not just within the smart cities, but I would certainly say also into the smart kampongs. And for that, we have called together the government agencies together with the key service providers, and hence we now have this new thing called the Jendela program, which is meant to improve coverage by way of expansion of fiber, by way of the footprint of 4G, which will then allow us to move into the 5G space, which in essence would then allow us to really optimize a lot of the new technologies and applications that will come forth within a smart city ecosystem. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fazul, for the good explanation and sharing about the MCMC's current, as I recall, the MTFB, Malaysian Technical Forum Berhad. Next, to Mr. Shah, based on Dr. Fazul's explanation that we require the partnership on creating good standards development. Assessing and managing smart city standards require understanding the strength of relevant stakeholders and ultimately deliver of improving the function of the city by helping city leaders reach their broader target and goals. As for the Malaysian Smart City Alliance, can you simply explain to us any initiative, partnership, or collaboration on developing the standards for the smart cities? Mr. Shah?
Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. To all the panelists, Dr. Abdul, Farabi, and Malik from Japan Standards, and Mike. Very interesting is that the world today is talking about smart cities, and we all live in existing cities, and we're talking about going into smart cities. So my fundamental thing about leaders is that leaders need to understand that as human beings living in cities, we use resources, water, electricity. First is the communications. It's all basic utilities that government started when they built cities. They're all called utilities. To be used by the rakyat, by the citizens, people who live in the cities. So the fundamental leadership is that they have to understand that these are all utilities which are required today. Connectivity becomes a utility. Myself being involved with the fiber to the home standards and regional for Asia Pac, leadership to understand that whether it's fiber, whether it's wireless, the connectivity becomes critical for today's citizens and communities to be connected. But the fundamental challenge is that if you go back, I'll share a small story about my father-in-law who was involved with the British engineers in 1960s. How did the British Empire build cities in many countries? They had standards. They had standards of measures which were used to build infrastructure, whether it's for infrastructure for cities. So first thing is that leadership is required, is that they need to know that there needs to be connectivity. What type of connectivity? And in which area, which layer? Layer 0, which is the physical infrastructure, whether it's at the data center level or at the app layer. So as the director for standards has mentioned, there are many bodies involved in the Global Mobile Association, GSMA, then you have the TM Forum Standards. So what are all these different bodies where the people who I represent, the alliance, the Malaysian Smart City Alliance, we are all vendors and suppliers to the ecosystem. What is required is that who do we benchmark our delivery of, whether it's product or services? Where do we benchmark it? Who is the enforcer? Who is the person who makes sure it's compliant? And as Muhammad Farabi mentioned, he wants to have KPI indicators for all the different cities in Malaysia. That is the end result. But the planning, the design, the implementation is complying to which standards? Is it complying to the wireless standards? Is it complying to the enterprise standards? Is it complying to the IoT standards? There are so many interrelated issue. Then you have standards body like CIDP instead of engineers. So it becomes very complex. Therefore, like the old story of the British engineers, they have a handbook. The handbook tells you what is the mix of the cement, what is the strength of the steel, what type of steel, how do you build roads, what is the measurement, what is the depth. So that is what we have to lead to together as a team, together with Plan Malaysia, with standards, with MCMC, and the industry, to make sure that as an ecosystem, when the vendors are deploying solutions, the leadership at the council level, at the state level, at the national level, have a common measurement tool to measure, has the deployment been as to the minimum requirement of the standards. And one very, very important ecosystem that you have to understand is that all vendors are deploying solutions at the app layer, at the application layer. You need to have an open API interface. It cannot be proprietary. Okay, in Majlis Perundang Sepang, other platform. Later, when you try and integrate this data, oh, sorry, this is proprietary. You cannot connect to me. So among all this now, one of the what do you call associations that is in together is TM Forum, which is trying to aggregate all the different requirements from all the different type of standards, associations, bodies, ITU, IEEE, TIA, GSMA, Open Network Association, Open RAN. Where do you benchmark and who is the enforcer and compliance reviewer? If there is no such thing, it will be a total chaos of expenditure of X billions of dollars to every city, and you will get orang utara cakap pasembo lah, rojak dapat. And it'll be a mess. Therefore, from the industry perspective, from the alliance perspective, it's very, very important to have a benchmark standards which covers whether it's enterprise in the buildings, whether it's going out application layer where young people can develop applications to run at IR 4.0 or connectivity solutions or applications for the citizen and for Rakyat. So very, very important. Our team here, very, very good effort by Mike to put together the government, the regulator, Plan Malaysia, to see that whatever we are doing for the future generations, that our resources of water, electricity, and basic planning for the future is done using smart digital infrastructure. With that, all of us in the industry are hoping that there is some very clear guidelines so that this can be deployed in a very efficient and effective manner without waste of capital resources for the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shah, for the explanation, and also thank you for your fruitful sharing session, sharing about your organization contribution. Just now, we heard about the vast contribution of Plan Malaysia to smart cities development, starting with the Malaysia Smart City Framework, and also the process of developing the standards in Malaysia by the JSM, Standards Malaysia, and also what are the list of relevant technical report, guideline, and related document from MCMC in relevant to the smart cities development, and also from Mr. Shah that how do we connect all stakeholders in smart city ecosystem to be under one same direction and uniform standardization, and also to benchmark others international standards as our guideline. Now, I would like to bring our panelists to expand our discussion upon this topic to the key question to address. Let me begin with Mr. Farabi. What are the roles of the standards for smart city development, especially in the post-COVID-19 pandemic situation impacted in Malaysia right now? Mr. Farabi?
I think before we talk about the post-pandemic, I think we need to be focused on what we have today about the stock taking. So smart city is about a change of cities from the, I would say, conventional cities that we are developing now towards a digitalization of the city. So this digitalization of the city involves a lot about data. So data is going to be a new waste in the, I'm not saying to the word waste in the future, but we are going to play with a lot of data in the future. So which data is very important. So from the Plan Malaysia perspective, we see the standards is very important in terms of setting the roles in three aspects. The first one is about strategic way forward. We know that smart city is very, it's not too new, but after the IR 4.0, we can see a lot of cities are gearing up towards smart city, but we don't have any direction during that time, and that's the reason the framework came in. So the framework of the smart city is like a textbook for the smart city. But however, at the city levels, we have about more than 200 cities in Malaysia, and every cities have their uniqueness based on their localities. So this city administrator who managing the cities need a very good direction. So these standards, especially what we are developing now, indicators for the smart city, supposed to be the new textbooks for the smart cities to be implemented at the local level, because we want to benchmark what Shah mentioned. What we are trying to benchmark with. So now with this standard, we hope in the future that whatever smart initiative that have been implemented in any cities in Malaysia can be compared apple to apple to any cities in the world. So we have been talking about the probably Malaysian standard is not at par with the British standard or with the ISO standard. So this is the reason that we need what Mr. Miza said earlier. We need a very good consensus from every parties and every perspective. We have industry, we have the government sectors, and also we have the public. We need to bear in mind that whatever smart cities that we are doing, it should be a human-centric smart cities. So public supposed to be our focus. Whatever we don't want to, waste the resources in terms of developing a smart cities that not are going to benefit the public. And I think the standard that we are doing now is about the indicators for smart cities. It also can be a strategic way forward in terms of setting up priorities. Because if you look at the document for the standard, there will be 80 indicators that be outlined by the International Standard Organization. But out of 80 indicators, we need prioritize based on our resources. We couldn't do it at one go. So this could be a very good tools. I would say personally, it would be a very good tools for the city administrator for the change management, from the conventional way of developing a cities to the way forward toward a smart city. So these indicators and standard could be a tool for change management. And the last one is about the benchmarking for a certain standard, like Shah mentioned earlier. So we can compare this with the international standard that have been developed by many parties. So we are not far from the developed countries in terms of standard. The second one is about process. So process is about system and services. In smart cities, there is a lot of data sharing, data integration. So this data integration and data sharing need a very good standard in terms of when we talk about the interoperability and integration. So we know with a vast of data, cybersecurity is very important. So cybersecurity is also being highlighted in the Malaysian Smart City Framework. Is talk about the privacy of the data, and the third one is about the technical digital infrastructure. So I'm very glad that Dr. Fazula is with us. We are strong supporter to you, Doc, in terms of improving the Jendela, especially. So this technical digital infrastructure, we need a standard and focus on the connectivity. So connectivity is prerequisite to any smart cities. Without connectivity, you can't talk about the smart cities. So this connectivity, we know that smart city, there is a lot of IoT in the future, Internet of Things, and now we are talking about Internet of Everything. So everything can talk to each other now. Then we know at the city levels, we have CCTV devices. So they are like ear and eyes of the cities. So these devices, if we didn't have a standard in the beginning, it's going to be chaos like what Shah mentioned earlier. So there is a CCTV that couldn't do a functionality of face recognition. So you have any incident, but you couldn't trace let's say the plate number of a car. So you couldn't trace the crime that happened to any specific site. So we also talk about the integration and interoperability. So this data sharing especially need a lot of interoperability and integration. And as the smart city is still at the initial stage, we know that a lot of big cities are gearing up for the smart cities, but we couldn't forget that our cities, majority of our cities in Malaysia is actually small and intermediate cities. So these cities need to also scale up the smart city implementation. So in scaling up the smart city implementation, we also need a standard in terms of to make sure that for the future, the smart city that implemented in any type of cities in Malaysia could be at certain standard. And the last one is about the accessibility. So we need a standard on this technical aspect to make sure that accessibility is being accessible to all type of levels. So we know that data cybersecurity is very important, and the accessibility is also very important to set a standard for the future. So back to the question that Dr. Kamaro have highlighted earlier. So post-COVID and I think pre-COVID for urban planning, there is a lot of changes. So we are talking about the development, whether it could be in the high density, and now cycling culture is something that is booming in Malaysia. So this cycling and walking is actually one of the very close topic that is very close to us as the town planners. So now you can see a lot of people are cycling, but whether our cities are ready with this cycling infrastructure. So we need also a standard in developing this. We understand that the safety of the pedestrian and also the cyclist is very important. And but I think the most affected, I would say, the lifestyle is about the way because during the MCO, the school is closed, we couldn't go to the works, and people are depending on the connectivity. So this is the reason digital infrastructure standard should be given emphasis in this. And I believe might have taken a very good step to lead on the digital infrastructure as well. And we welcome the collaboration with the MITES and Malaysian Smart City Alliance and other parties as well to improve the digital infrastructure to ensure that our connectivity is good. And we also talk about how the housing and commercial area should be designed after the post-pandemic. And probably we have a lot of, more than 40 standard that we have in Plan Malaysia now, standard in terms of commercial housing and everything. And probably we need to look at this to make it as a mandatory standard in the future. For smart city standard now that we are developing, it is more on the voluntary because smart city is still at the initial stage. But however, we couldn't go to the mandatory standard for a certain area in the future. So I think that's all the sharing from me.
Thank you, Farabi, for the explanation about the roles and needs of standards for smart city development. As what I can highlight from what Farabi has mentioned just now, it is important to have the standards as a strategic way forward of the city's planning. And also the standards should be the new textbooks for the smart city development. And also it is a very good tools for the city administration for the future smart city development. And also the most important is the standards is how to connect us with the others, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic issues. Also, okay, next, Mr. Miza, in regarding to the standards Malaysia position in developing the standards, what are the issues and challenge to implement the standards for the smart city development in Malaysia, especially during this current situation of the post-COVID-19 pandemic? We cannot do a physical meeting, we cannot have interaction between stakeholders, we have to do the virtual How do you see that as an issue and challenge on implementing, on developing the standards for the smart cities? Mr. Miza?
Thank you, Doctor. I think that's the concern that we are currently facing with regard to the COVID-19 when we talk about development process. As I mentioned there, the process of development involves a lot of interaction, as you mentioned, a lot of engagements. When the government started to announce the MCO, so in fact, at the time we will definitely close our office. Then we have to manage the committee that develop standards online and whatnot. So definitely, I mean, it's not only affected Standards Malaysia, but also our sister organization all over the world, like Mr. Farabi mentioned about BSI, our counterpart, even though he said that may not be equivalent, but we are equivalent in a sense that we are both national standards body. But what I would like to highlight here, basically, this is the challenge that we have as a national standards body when it comes to standards development process. So we have to opt to online mechanism. So thanks to the infrastructure that we have currently, Dr. Fatullah mentioned about the infrastructure that MCMC has been entrusted to work on. I think we have a very good connectivity right now. So it helps a lot in terms of the development process. Secondly, in terms of, accessibility to the standard. Actually, our proposal, basically, we would like to develop national standard for smart city. It's at national level. So even though, as Mr. Farabi mentioned, we may, and also Mr. Shah also mentioned about we may adopt and adapt other existing international standards, or even at national level standards like BSI or maybe Singapore standards or whatnot. So, but the pride that we have, basically, we want to have this at national level, at national standards level. So definitely COVID-19 has tremendously affected our work in terms of the development process. Because when we start a project for standards development, the committee will set a timeline. When we set a timeline, for example, for adoption, maybe 9 months. So when we can't have meetings, we can't have maybe some site visit and whatnot. So it's very difficult. It will definitely, affect our work. So that's one. It's about the development of Malaysian standard. Number one is number two is basically about the compliance. When we talk about compliance, I just want to highlight one example with regard to the standards for example, Information Security Management System, ISMS. For Information Security Management System, when the certification body, for example, they cannot go and audit the company. So it's very much related to the, MCO, you cannot travel to this part of area. So this is something that really affected what we have currently. The other point that I just highlighted about the accessibility. When we convert as Malaysian standard, for example, when we adopt international standards, for example, ISO 37210 about the indicators as Malaysian standard. So the benefit that we have, basically, when the accessibility part. So the original ISO 37210, for example, if we adopt it as Malaysian standard, it can reduce the cost of, the price of the original document of ISO. So the ISO standard, for example, now is the original price of ISO 37210 for indicators is about 200 Swiss franc. When we convert to Malaysian ringgit, it's about 900, 1,000. So it's very costly. So this is why even during the pandemic, a lot of national standards body as well as international standards body, they have already given free access to those standards that are really needed by the industry. In fact, at at Standards Malaysia level, we also open up a few standards that can be freely, view. They can access. Public can access the standards with no cost. It's freely available on view access. So this is something that we do to help the when they want to refer to certain standards. So they don't have to purchase the standard. We can just view on the website, on our website, the relevant standards that we have opened up for public viewing, so that it will help the industry, help the stakeholders to mitigate the risk or the to combat the pandemic. The other one is about the it was quite interesting when the previous speaker, Mr. Shah, highlighted that there are we need to also take into consideration the interoperability and also interoperability, interconnectivity, and also even interchangeability, because this is the role of standards when we develop. When we have to bear in mind that smart city cut across all sectors. So when we develop smart city standards, it does not mean we encroach other committees. So there have been already standards, as I mentioned. We are now having 5,000 national standards in various sectors. They might be standards in building construction, might be standards for energy. So the role of the committee to develop smart city standards basically have to take into consideration that we cannot reinvent the wheel. We have already existing existing standards that have been already developed. Maybe the thing that we have to do basically to map and also to maybe to upgrade standards, because some standards, especially in building codes, for example, a lot of old business standards is still being enforced, is still being implemented. So we have to update it. I think Mr. Shah rightly mentioned about the use of fiber optic and copper. So this is something that we have to map, and also advise the other committee that you have to align your work with the smart city initiative that we are currently having. I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miza, for the explanation about the issue and challenge faces by the Standards Malaysia in developing standards, especially on the smart city development. We know that to assess the source of expertise in developing smart city standards is very crucial part in getting the information, the ideas of creating good base of smart cities expertise. And also Mr. Miza also highlight about the smart city requirement from Malaysia environment is needed to align with what we should establish on the standards, and also the issues on engagement during the COVID-19 is a very tough condition about on getting the standards to be mobilized. And also the most thrilling part is about the compliance and accessibility. Okay, we go to our next panelist is Dr. Fazul. Okay, based on sharing just now about the MCMC regulatory and guideline, how the standards beneficial to the smart city development based in the current post-COVID-19 pandemic? Dr. Fazul?
Let's just take a step back. Okay, we all talk about smart cities. Then you have another term called healthy cities. Okay, so obviously that is what Farabi alluded to, his bicycle tracks, his running tracks, and all that stuff. Okay, I think we all need to dovetail and actually agree on what is the animal smart city is all about. Because once we are very clear as to what the animal is all about, only then can we talk about standards. Sometimes we tend to be putting ourselves ahead of everything, trying to put the cart before the horse. Okay, so maybe it's wise now that we've had this unfortunate incident of COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe we ask, hey, let's take stock of where we are. Because only when we take stock of where we are can we then decide how do we then move forward. Shah asked, who is going to oversee this? Yeah. I'm going to be a bit, mischievous here and say, look, this is all about planning. So maybe Plan Malaysia could say, okay, they will then draw up on the white canvas and say, this is how a smart city or smart, healthy city should look like. And thereof, these are the key things that every city needs to have. Because we all need to understand, from a governance standpoint, cities are governed by local authorities. And if local authorities understand documents differently, I can tell you the technical guys will go bonkers. Even for us, when you talk about communications, Shah talked about communications being a utility. Until today, there are only two utilities that you will actually get cited off when you do your development order or kebenaran merancang: water and electricity, not even telecommunications, right? So what happens is that telecommunications, which is so important in a connected city, becomes a lagging utility. So then you say, all right, now that you can come in, what sort of infrastructure must you have in the telecommunications? And telecommunications come in two forms. One, something that goes through the wires, where that gets laid underground. That is called the fixed service, and that is where all fiber optics will go to. Secondly, you talk about the wireless, which is the mobile. This is where all these little structures that you see behind your house, on top of your roof, and many of us will say, I want my service in my house, but not in my backyard. Okay, so again, you have a problem. And when you do the cable laying, it's so nice to have fiber to the house. And suddenly, you have the developer deciding to copper up the wires within the wall. And suddenly, you can't get the kind of speeds that you want for connectivity. You see, these are all the disconnects that we have, okay? No doubt, all of them adhere to a technical standard. Nobody will say, oh, my copper specs are in accordance to the standard. My routers are in accordance to the standard. Yada, yada, yada. But we're not getting the end impact of what we all want, we hope to achieve. And that is where we are today. Okay. Now, once you have all that nicely placed, then we can talk about, common language to connect to each other. Okay, so those are the standards that we all talk about. Standards of connectivity, standards of security, standards of everything. And I do believe that when you talk about standards, maybe we also need to also talk about the standard of data sharing. Paravi says, you're going to have a lot of data. Guess what? Everybody wants to keep their own data. So yeah, we all have a lot of data in our own pockets, but we don't share with each other. And we are not so smart because of that. So when we plan a smart city, we need to make sure that we also have the data governance policy in place. Nothing about standards here. It's about a governance policy whereby data can be kept by individual data generators, but it's all connected through a common highway that certain data can be shared amongst each other. Okay, like the recent Jendela that we had. Thank you, Plan Malaysia. You guys were, instrumental in helping us there. And we all realized that by having this thing called the Jendela dashboard or the communication infrastructure management system, it is actually very useful because for that to happen, you need data from DOSM, you need data from Plan Malaysia, you need data from many, many people. But if we don't open it up for the rest of the agencies to use, then the data is only good for MCMC, which is not optimal. Okay, and therefore we have an approach where the data governance is that we will actually open up and share with everyone. If we can have that as our policy, then certainly having whatever standards that we have, whatever data that we collect to build up new standards, it will be well appreciated by everybody. Okay, and of course, when we have the data that's connected, we have data that is shared, we need to make sure that it is also reliable. Okay, and this is where the standards of every device that generates data has a common parameter or common standard of what it needs to push out so that we can all talk to each other. Let me just take a step back and talk about healthcare. We talk about this electronic medical record. We have many public hospitals, many private hospitals, and many of them actually have electronic medical records. But can you as a patient move from hospital to hospital and your records follow you? No, because the records are kept there. And sometimes it's because of data governance or simply because it's proprietary. So the reliability of the system is that it must not work on a proprietary basis. It must be interoperable. Okay? And then, so when you have a network, a stable network, you have a secure network, you have a reliable connectivity, both at network and at data, and it is all interoperable. Hopefully, that will then be able to fall nicely into the big map of the smart, healthy city. Okay, so today I would say, do we need standards? Yes, we do need standards. I think we need to take a step back, draw that big map of what that animal called smart cities or smart, healthy city is all about, and then we can all, work it down into those areas. And certainly, a lot of standards have been developed. Documents have also been published. We at MCMC have also published a couple of documents in relation to this. But these are documents. These are not international benchmarks that we can say, yes, this is the thing. We are creating the future somewhat, and therefore we need to be brave and say, okay, this is the best jump-off point in terms of common parameters and standards, and then we move into that space. But as long as we are not proprietary, I think we should be okay moving forward, because consumers at the end of the day are consumers. They don't know about standards. All they know is, I can use this service. Okay, who knows whether your traffic lights are talking to each other? As far as I'm concerned, I don't want to be stuck at a traffic light when that turns green and the other traffic light also turns green, because thank you, we all meet together in a hospital after that. Okay, so then the city ain't so smart after all. Over to you, Kamaru.
Fazul, for the great explanation and example of the benefit of the smart cities, and that we need to look over what are currently what we want from the standard. Actually, we don't just create a standards, but we don't follow the standards. Okay. Next, Mr. Shah. Just now we heard that the partnership and collaboration from MSCS involved in developing smart system for goods of smart city development comprised of many players and stakeholders related to the smart cities, either from the public sector or from the industry players. The question is now, who are the potential end user to beneficial the standards for the smart city development? Mr. Shah?
Okay, thank you, Cik Miza, Dr. Fadul, and Farabi. Concluded by it was not a serious comment about who is going to be the policer. The point is that because of all the councils involved, who is going to then monitor the entire ecosystem? So you've got multiple vendors. So what happens? So the end user, as Dr. Fadula mentioned, is that the consumer doesn't want to know about vendor A, network B, connectivity is lost. He only wants to know, I want to get home. Can I get home fast? Which is the way to get home? The roads are not flooded, So that's what the consumer wants. And the vendors, what they want to know is that if we are going to deploy a solution, the solution is, the requirements are clear, and they are compliant to a international standard or benchmark standard. So going back to the point about the fundamental layer for the contractor or the supplier or the alliance is basically is that if you do not have the communication layer, which is the connectivity layer that Dr. Fazula alluded to, it's not a utility yet in Malaysia. I was involved in the NBN in Australia. I was involved in the Chorus Fiber in New Zealand, in the Singapore Open Network. That Farabi had mentioned that you want it to be utility. This has to happen. This has to happen. Utility has to happen. Without that, it cannot move. Then the other thing is that there's some background noise. The other thing is that basically is that the end user only wants a solution delivered. Dr. Fazula mentioned, I only want to be able to enjoy it. So when the vendors are trying to give a solution, they must look at the end solution that is being delivered, that is the rakyat or the citizens are going to benefit, whether it's going to be saving them time, whether it's going to be saving them, is it safe and secure city, or is it going to be they have water in their pipes, you know, or whether they're going to have digital connectivity for their education for their children, or for themselves, or open learning, distant learning. So for the contractor and association alliance, basically is that we want a very clear, indicative specification delivered and the end result. So going back to the point about Miza was mentioning about the codes, different codes. There's so many codes. How would a vendor know what is being the requirement? If the local councils are going to issue bids for this, or the government is going to issue bids for networks or apps or whatever, and if you do not have the open data, open digital architecture, ODA under TM Forum, so open digital architecture, and the vocabulary is not same, the councils and the IT guys will be talking A, the guys who are delivering solutions will talk B, the guy who is receiving the product is C. So it'll be a total mess. So the vocabulary and learning must be very important. Under the alliance, we are setting up a framework where this vocabulary can be shared with all the KPKT and the local councils to be able to understand the vocabulary and what are the technical specs which they can look at and compare and learn. So the alliance wants to be a database or a aggregator of all this data so that they can share with the implementer, with the designer, with the planner, so that they can see, okay, what are we talking about? This is benchmark to which standard? Therefore, it becomes easy for us to deploy in a very cost-effective manner, which have an impact to the customer and the rakyat to deliver the solution. So that's the alliance main focus, is that to be able to benchmark and have data, and the planners and the local councils are also up the curve on the awareness, the vocabulary, the requirements at the benchmark level. That is the interest of the alliance and the association, and myself has been involved in the industry for a long time. All countries need that Dr. Fazula mentioned, is that they do not have the utility yet. Without the connectivity, I myself as a company, I deployed 2009 in Subanjaya. It has been many countries is a law by treasury of the Singapore government. Fiber is a utility. I supplied 20 years ago Singapore. So these are basic infrastructure at the communications layer. Then you have the data layer, which Dr. Fazula mentioned, and the app layer. The app layer becomes very, very important for vendors, young graduates, young entrepreneurs, to be able to use the data which they can get from an open interface. The open API platform, very important. It's not proprietary. As you said, it's proprietary, or I cannot get this data. With all the different protections for the security of the PDP, and with all the key securities, this data is very important for open API, so that the young people who want to innovate and create apps are able to use the data, big data that's going to come out from this open data layer, becomes very, very important. If you do not create this, it is just again like those days, silos and silos and silos. So the association, the industry is looking and very easy for them to deploy solutions for the rakyat and the citizens of Malaysia, inshallah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shah, about the explanation on the end user. Who are the potential end user? Basically, we see that it's not important to see who are the end user, but somehow what are the potential solution for the end user is more important. For example, like the vendor want the solution to deploy the smart city development, and the people just want to know either the cities can be is work and the city can give them good services. It's good to have all the question answered by all the all the panelists. So we have many information and knowledgeable input from our panelists today about the roles, the issues, the benefits, and impact of the standards in the smart city development. Perhaps it is good to get some question from the audience here for further clarification by the panelists in related to the topic we had just discussed just now. We'd like to see either have any question arise by our audience today. Is there any question? We don't see any question from the audience, and I assume that they understand and they get the information very crystal clear from our panelists today. It's a very good to have our panelists today to give a good explanation, a good example, and a very what we call the fruitful key point to be highlighted based on what we are discussing now, and hopefully the objective of this session can be achieved in related to the roles, the needs of the standards, and what are the understanding on the standards for our Malaysia's environment. Maybe I would like to ask one question to all the panelists, either Farabi, Miza, Dr. Fazul, or Shah can answer this about the standards. My question is, how can cities create and share the understanding to deliver the vision of smart cities, especially in Malaysia? Any of the panelists can answer it about how can cities create the shared and share the understanding to deliver the visions on having standards for the development.
Probably I could start first. I think we talk about any development of cities, whether it's regardless is smart or not a smart city. So I think the most important thing is to have a common goals and common objective, or we call at the United Nations levels is called as a shared goals. So these common goals can be interpreted if we have the common understanding in what Shah mentioned earlier. So I think after have been look at the smart cities indicators for the past 6 months, I would say that the indicators that have been set in the standard is actually a vision that should be interpreted by the city administrator. So they mentioned a lot about the there is 19th dimension that have been touched in the smart city indicators. And I think the 19 dimensions is very comprehensive and cover every walk of life. And I think if the city is administrator really focus on what have been identified by the standard, and I do believe it has been discussed thoroughly at the global levels and taking into consideration many cases of many historical part, different country, different culture. And I do believe if we look at that and we implement that in Malaysia, it can be a very good textbook for the city administrator for the now.
Okay, thank you Farabi for the answer about the question. Okay, I just received one question that might specifically to Mr. Miza from Standard Malaysia. Mr. Miza, the question from the floor is, what is the fastest way to implement the standards? We need to start the implementation. Either can we adopt the basic and work to enhancing the standard later? It's about what are the fastest way to implement the standards?
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. Well, basically, as I mentioned, so we have to, have a committee to look into the what are the appropriate standards, what are the appropriate requirements that we have to put together in coming up with the what we call a national standard. In terms of implementation, of course, what I've just highlighted, we have to include all stakeholders, balanced representation in our committee when it comes to the implementation part. Because when we establish the standard, of course, we need to also take into consideration how these standards will be implemented. How can this, provision or clauses of the standard can be implemented? Whether through what mechanism? Either to as Dr. Fatul mentioned, there are also needs to look into the mandatory part of the compliance with certain standard. I do agree that standards is voluntary, even at MCMC level, at MSTB, Malaysian Standards, Malaysian Technical Standards Forum. Also, they publish voluntary standards, same as. Standards Malaysia, we publish voluntary national standards. The only organization or bodies that can enforce compliance is basically the regulatory agency. In this case, I do agree with Dr. Fatul that the city, the local government at that level they have the power under their own act and also regulation to enforce certain compliance. Even though at the compliance part, in terms of the process of standards development, even though for adoption of, for example, an ISO standard to become international, and ISO standards to become a national standard, it may be shortened because of the committee has already agreed that these are requirements, or these are clauses that we can adopt totally. It can be shortened. Perhaps I just mentioned just now is a normal process of 9 months. We can also process it maybe 1 or 2 months, because we have many other options of deliberating the standards. For example, we do have maybe some workshops, so we shorten the time frame in terms of trying to meet once in 1 month. So there are various options, there are various mechanisms that we can shorten the time frame of standards development. The only thing that when you want to implement the standard, so of course we have to look into our infrastructure. For example, if the standards need further confirmation, like for example, there are clauses that for example, building standards, there are maybe some of the building materials need to be tested. Then we have to ask ourselves, do we have these testing facilities in Malaysia? So there are various concerns and various considerations that we have to look into before we can implement certain standard. That is why we have to establish the committee. Thanks to Plan Malaysia, who will be drive this committee as they are chairman of this committee. So this is where the standards development process is very important to look into various implications, various in terms of what kind of infrastructure that we have to develop in term when it comes to the implementation of the standard. So I cannot give definite answer, but there are various considerations. But definitely, the committee headed by Plan Malaysia will be looking into the implementation part in general. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miza, for the explanation on how do we have the fast implementation of the standards. Maybe perhaps after this, our collaboration between Mike, Plan Malaysia, and Standards Malaysia, and also MSCA members on our project on the implementing developing the sustainable Malaysia smart city standards focus on infrastructure can align with the ways of your fastest on implementation the standard. Okay, we have another 10 minutes, I think. Okay, I will go to the last questions.
Can I just make a comment? Can I just make a comment?
Sure, can. Go, Mr. Shah.
Okay, on Cik Miza's comment, I presented the paper in ITU in Reading about 5 years ago. Plan Malaysia and local council have a major process change that is required. So I created the word called the digital municipal councils. Are councils ready for this? They are not ready for this. There's a skill set, huge skill set, awareness, learning, education that has to happen in the KPKT, local council, architecture, in their processes. Otherwise, this is going to be just a hanging. Music council cannot happen without all the officers becoming aware of the terminologies, the grammar, the understanding of meanings, as Dr. Fazul alluded to. You're all going to talk, Apple, Roja, and all over the place. So that whole process has to happen at the local council level. And again, when the MCMC puts a regulation for operators or the Jendela program, when they go to the councils and they talk about we need to do this, the KPKT officer says, we're not experts at this, we don't know anything. You tell us what to do. So there's going to be big disjointed. So the speed of this can only happen with a lot of education and awareness and training at the KPKT council level, together with all the regulators and the MITE and the association, to give an education and awareness program. That's my comment.
Thank you for the additional information about on the standards. Okay, we have the final question arise from the audience. I think this question is good for Dr. Fazul to answer it, because the question is on the standards or any related document can be developed by Standard Malaysia, MCMC, and MTFB. But how we want to make sure that the standard is being complied to each other? Is there any enforcement to be done, Dr. Fazul?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Doc. Usually when you talk about compliance, and enforcement, there must be a tool that ties everybody to do this, For service providers, it's probably easier in the sense that we have the license. So the license comes with conditions. And then the fact that the license is actually a product of a law, it also allows us as regulators to provide certain mandatory standards that they must comply to. Say, for instance, the mandatory quality of service, mandatory standards for quality of service. So these are sort of things that we have already in place that allows us to provide some level of enforcement. However, not all codes fall under the purview of enforcement umbrella. Okay, so hence, whilst codes should be adopted, they can be adopted on a voluntary basis. Okay, and if the adoption of those codes, or rather the non-adoption of those codes, causes a lower level of service to the end customer, causing resulting in a non-compliance to a mandatory standard for quality of service, then yes, MCMC is able to then undertake a penalty onto the service provider who had actually not met to the level, the mandatory standards. So that would be, if you want, the broad framework of how enforcement is undertaken with regards to the compliance and adoption of standards. But I need to re-emphasize that standards, as in anywhere in the world, is always going to be voluntary. Okay, and many companies or service providers will only adopt it if it makes sense for them as they serve the end customer. And as a agency that oversees the whole industry, we too have the same objective, which is to make sure that customers at the end of the day do not get shortchanged on any of the services that they procure.
Thank you, Dr. Fazul, for the response on the question on the any enforcement to be done for the standards comply to each other. We have another 5 minutes now, so maybe I would like to conclude our discussion with some wish list from each panelist in related to the development of the standards for smart cities in Malaysia. Maybe we start with Farabi. What are your wish lists about the standards for the smart cities?
Thank you, Doc. If you ask me personally on the wish list, I think the first is about the smart city planning, because our resources is very limited. So for us to plan a smart city, we need to have a planning part, given a very big emphasis on the planning part. And the second one is we should focus on the digital infrastructure, because smart cities, technology for it to fulfill its full potential, I think we did a range of standards are needed to address different issues. So I think for now, as I said, mentioned earlier, prerequisite to the smart city is about connectivity. So we need to give a focus on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Miza, what are your wish list about this standards?
Thank you, Doc. Apparently, of course, as the national standards body, we would like to have the the Malaysian version smart city standards as fast as we can, because it will, as other panelists has mentioned, so we need this standard because of a lot of agencies are looking into these standards as something that will drive the initiative as far as smart city is concerned. I also agree with Dr. Fatul that standard is voluntary, but of course it can be mandated by various regulatory agencies under their own law. So in this regard, so we have to seriously look into the proposal. Maybe I can't recall, but Mr. Farabi, about the role of the city council. Because of they have the authority, so they have the authority. So this is what my wish. We hope that we can expedite the process. So we would like to sincerely thank Mike for driving this, initiative, and headed by the committee headed by the Prime Minister, of course, with the support of industry through Malaysia Smart City Alliance, Mr. Shah. So of course, the regulatory agency like MCMC is very crucial for the development of Malaysian standard in this sector.
Thank you, Mr. Miza, for the wish list. And next we go to Dr. Fazul. What are your wish lists and related?
Well, the wish list could be very long, but the only one wish list that I would say that is of utmost importance is to make sure that local authorities treat connectivity as a utility. Okay, because we get that right at first base, everything else will fall into place quite easily, because that is the most difficult first base for connectivity to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fazul, for the wish list. And finally, Mr. Shah, what is your wish list? Maybe 30 seconds.
Bismillah.
30 seconds or
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Niat is very important. We are doing this all to save our future generations, the resources that we have. The Niat is very important. I always say leadership is very important. Ashwara, mashwara, like what we're doing together, sharing and having an objective. Mashwara is very important. Shared objectives are very important. Inshallah, we work together as a team, share our resources, share our ideas, and achieve that the future generations and whatever Allah has amanah to us in this dunya, we take care of it using our intellect, our knowledge, our digital knowledge to take care of the future generations and the rakyat of Malaysia, inshallah. All our efforts be blessed, inshallah. Ameen.
I mean, inshallah. Thank you, Mr. Shah, for the very good wish list to conclude all the wish lists from the panelists. So I thank you to all our respective panelists for your fruitful and knowledgeable sharing session with us upon the standards for the smart city developments. I give back the floor to our MC.
Thank you, Arif, and our distinguished panelists today for a very fruitful discussion. I do hope that today's talk has benefited everybody. If you have any colleagues or friends who couldn't join us this afternoon, they can actually rewatch the webinar on Mike's YouTube channel. We do look forward to we hope that you can join us in our next webinar session. Do follow us on Mike Malaysia's Twitter, IG, and Facebook for further information. You can also contact the Secretariat to subscribe to our webinar series. Have a nice evening ahead, everyone. Bye-bye. See you again. Thank you. Bye.